other end, right? So the question is, are we about generating a pathway from one to the other? Because that's certainly a lot of things we talked about were about bringing them in. Or are we okay with saying, like, look, if you do vernacular technology on your own in your community and you never get a job at Microsoft, right? Like and I think we would say that's okay too. But it's something that we might want to sort of explicitly decide, what the pathway is and what is it for and what the endpoint is and what the alternatives to the pathway that we want to think about or include are as well.
I think that's brilliant because the parallel of course is in scholars and organic intellectuals. Because part of my work has been to try to, how come organic intellectuals in the community are not cited or their ideas respected, or they're even given ownership of their ideas or their innovations? What makes going to a university or being part of the mainstream maker culture, how is that, making that knowledge more palatable or real than what other folks are doing in more informal and what we're calling vernacular.
Right.
Let's get back to the humanity piece. If we are intending to make a pathway where there is a traditional field that doesn't have a lot of representation, and then we have a conduit through maker spaces or these activities, like I think from a humanity standpoint, we can be innovative together if all the ideas from all the different types of minds come together. So as one large ideal of making sure that everyone can be more innovative by having an intersection with people that are very different from them.
Right.
So I think that main goal, whether it's taking people from the main industry into the niche areas,
right,
or it's taking people from the niche areas to the main, I think the goal in humanity.
So not as a trajectory, but thinking about it as sort of bringing people from different spaces together. Period.
I feel like
go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add a couple of things. I agree with Sylvia about the difficulties of Manifesto, but I think it might be a good exercise. If we're not happy with the Manifesto itself, I think the discussion is because it has to converge to some basic or some agreed upon ideas. I think it's a good exercise. Eamon and I in 2010, and some other people that you might know, like Karen from Harvard and Dor from Berkeley and all of that. So there was a conference called Constructionism 2010, and we did a panel called like Constructionists Under Construction. I don't know if you remember. But anyways, so we came up with like 4 principles for this kind of making constructionist learning and all of that. And I'm trying to find the actual slide to show, but I think that discussion was even though it was really hard to get to some basic principles, it was very useful to converge on some things we believe in and we are important in this discussion. I think in my own group here at Stanford, we try to work with 4 principles, but 2 of them that are relevant to this is this idea of epistemological pluralism, which is people have different ways of knowing and learning. We need to be accepting of that. Another one is that schooling should be in the service of equity. So that's something we should always think about. And
what did you say? Schooling should be in the service of
equity.
Equity.
Yeah. So just thinking about those 2 things, for example, if you look at the maker movement and the fact that 97% of the maker fair attendees have college degrees,
Right.
immediately we already understand that there is a big equity problem there.
Yeah.
So I think having in mind some principles like equity, pluralism, and things like that are important. And I think it's becoming even more important to think about principles. So I had a conversation with James the other day, who is, I don't know if he's here or not, but so he was telling me a shocking but interesting story about a project that he had of like creating this derby cars, little wooden cars that run on tracks and stuff like that.
Yeah, like Cub Scout Derby.
Nerdy Derby.
Nerdy Derby, yeah. And how it was like wildly successful at the Maker Faire every year and all of that. And then because Ford Motor, bought a big space at the Maker Faire, and they want to do their own derby thing, that his project was, they told him to go way back where no one can see it because it would compete with the Ford Motor version of it. And so, I mean, I think this is, the kind of thing that worries me, because I think there is like an increasingly dangerous set of conflict of interest in the maker movement. And, I've been saying for a long time that I think educators have to be in charge of it, because, we can't let like a company or, an organization that is not connected to education be in charge of something that has so much influence in how, basically 90% of the progressive education these days is channeled to the maker movement, right? So, I don't want that to be in the hands of people that have like, other kinds of agendas. And so just to say that I think the manifesto, whatever comes out of it might be a good way to think about an agenda that's not like, impositive or prescriptive, but just an agenda of principles and ideas that educators should think about when they are thinking about making, right? I think one of the, if there was one thing that the whole like FabLearn conferences, one thing made all of them be like, a valuable endeavor, which was, Leah's keynote talk in 2013, which I think really woke people up to this issue of inequity in the maker movement. And I think it has had a big, it has been very influential. And, I think this is the kind of thing that, we need to keep doing, right?
Good. I mean, I'm such a big fan of basically articulating, like, so much culture goes unwritten and unremarked. And I'm sort of, one of the things that to me is really interesting about this manifesto is that there is no manifesto for the maker movement, or there is, but it doesn't reflect what the actual, the inequities that we see in the groups are. Actually articulating a manifesto that is explicitly recognizing and speaking to these things, I think is valuable, sort of in and of itself, regardless of how short it is, regardless of whether people quote it, right? Like actually putting on the table, like, look, this is what a maker movement should actually look like, I think is a valuable exercise, but hopefully a valuable document.
I think if there's the existing document, there's an exercise that could get at some of these issues. And I wonder if we take the two letters, RE, and put like remake, just put that in front of most of the making, right? Because you've got an issue there with, it goes back to like remixing, and that was a valuable part of the Grandmaster Flash culture, and it's celebrated. But as educators, if to Paulo's point, if educators were running the maker fairs, reproducing other people's work is not necessarily a part of education that is, celebrated. And so if we, to Sylvia's point, if we go from the hackerspace to makerspace, is one of the things that I found, at least as an African American, and I don't want to be identified with the word hacker because of all of its negative connotations. And as a black male, there's so many negative connotations already placed on me when I walk in somewhere. I'm not going to voluntarily walk into yet another one. So maker was more, something that I could wear, and they didn't have any preconceived notions. Hacker, are you a terrorist, or are you X, Y, or Z? So as a remaking and remixing in an education setting, there's also a similar dynamic where if the expectation of a young African American male is that you are stealing, or is sort of negatively charged as opposed to a positive. So like remixing and remaking as opposed to being a creative endeavor is sometimes plagiarizing and stealing and those sorts of things. So just depending on who is doing it, there's those issues too. So if that can be brought to light by just say remaking and running that down the manifesto, does that bring up some of the differences in terms of who is doing the making and how that experience happens? So it might be an exercise worth doing.
Something else I wanted to note, I've been putting some stuff in the chat just as it comes to me, but the challenge of working with young people who may not see themselves as makers or see an entry point for making for them, they're interested in art or interested in game design or gaming, is trying to sort of provide examples that will bring them in. So here are some projects that bring in the kinds of things you're interested in personally or artistically or whatever. And these are the ways, what that does is, so Susan gives me a touch board. I take the touch board and I take it to school and I start creating projects that I know will engage musicians, high school students, or will engage dancers. And then then the next question for those students are, how did you make that? What is that device? How does it work? How can I make something? Not rather than saying, look at this, and here's a table full of parts, and put something together, which they may or may not do. Here's something that I think relates to the kinds of things that you might be interested in. Then the questions come. Then we have a good discussion, and then I'm kind of sort of guiding the discussion in some cases about how it relates to STEM. But the young people always ask me, how do you make that? How do you make that glove that when you use it, you look like a cyborg when you wear it, but then it does this really cool stuff with paintings. What is it? What is a sensor? What is, how does that work? How do you wire that thing? These are all questions that young people who may not even be interested in initially are now suddenly engaged. So how can you create a space, maker space in this case, or that engages that kind of inquiry, that kind of interest or engagement that may not just be there in of itself, is something that I'm really interested in trying to explore. It's a challenge because then also you have to translate that to teachers who may not have that training or that experience as well, and then don't know how to engage, create curriculum around that kind of space or that kind of tinkering, and how do you incorporate that into a curriculum map? So there are a couple of challenges there in terms of putting it in a school-based program, but even in an after-school-based program. How do you do that in a way that engages all these different stakeholders across the board and maybe across disciplines, and sort of redefine maker spaces that way?
Right. So unfortunately, I have to go.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Debbie. We really appreciate. I'm going to hand it over to Juliet, but maybe what we can do is Juliet can say our thank yous and start us off in just saying what was important about this and where we'd like to go from here. Go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Susan. Well, first, thank you for everyone who's able to make it, especially Debbie and Amon and Latrice. And I just feel like this has begun a very important conversation on the need to make it more inclusive and to take into account all the other great things that have already happened, and the different aspects of making that we have in many ways overlooked. And just a bit to add is that I think as you guys were talking, I was thinking more of in terms of making in the context in Africa is a lot different, because people do know makers, but because they don't associate making with something, unless you're making in a makerspace, it's something as grand. And I don't know if that's something that's similar in the US, but I think